Welcome back to our discussion in biblical leadership, CH 110. We continue in the life of Paul. And what we want to do is to begin a transition from the book of Acts into the second book of Corinthians. That's going to be the transition that we're going to attempt to make here. We have spent a lot of time in the book of Acts. We will continue in the book of Acts. However, somewhere along the line, we're going to have to make a transition so we get a bigger picture, a clearer picture of the leadership of Paul and why his leadership style and how he did, his character, the depth and breadth of his walk with Christ, why that should be the model that we should be emulating today. And one of the main issues that we want to attempt to get to here in these particular next sessions is going to be the leader's devotion to his people. The leader's devotion to his people. Now, I want to qualify that statement because today, by and large, most people that are operating in the realm of ministry, it's a term that I struggle with personally. In the realm of ministry, that term just drives me absolutely crazy because it has been interpreted as something that I do. This belongs to me, myself, and I. It's my ministry. And I'm asked that question often, and what is my ministry? I tell them I have no ministry. I'm in the ministry in serving the Lord Jesus Christ. It's His ministry. And so as a result, we have in a lot of places where the pastor, at least here in the southern part of the United States, in the West Coast, we see this here. I'm in the West Coast in Los Angeles, California. This is where I happen to be. My home base. You've seen me throughout different countries that I have been at, but this is my home base where I'm at, and I happen to be a pastor of a local congregation. One of the issues that we face here in the United States amongst several denominations is that the average pastor is in the pulpit or at his church serving for around roughly between 18 months to 2 years only, and then rotating in and rotating out to another church of some sort. I am baffled with that concept. I do not understand that whatsoever. It is a clear demarcation from the biblical standard that Paul establishes here. It is clearly a demarcation from the standard that the pastors and the preachers demonstrated clearly in the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, and even in the 20th century. However, in the latter half of the 20th century, somewhere between 1950s on to this date into the 21st century, that concept changed radically, where we now have pastors just rotating in and out of churches like they changed their socks. And so as a result, the church no longer has an appreciation or a respect for leaders because they know that they're only there for a short period of time. There seems to be this mentality, and the mentality it goes something like this: that I am at a small church just there long enough so I can get into a bigger church, and then to another church, into a bigger church, and that seems to be the object or the goal. My friend, if that's what your goal is, you should resign and leave the ministry because you're not devoted to God's people, nor are you devoted to God Himself. You're devoted to the God of yourself. That's what you're devoted to. So as we continue our conversation with Paul in Corinth, his leadership is under fire, and we want to come into this section talking about a leader's devotion to his people. Now, I've been the pastor at the same place now in Los Angeles, California. I've been pastoring a group here now this is my 33rd year in the ministry. That is nothing big to talk about. There are others who have been around for 40 and 50, 60 years by and large. But to speak to the issue of longevity in a church where you learn to love your people and your people learn to love you, and that doesn't mean that everything is hunky-dory, everything goes happy, everybody's happy all the time with you. No, we've had our share of battles and growing pains, but that's just what happens in a family. But I can tell you honestly, I love the church that I'm at. I've been there now for so long that I've had the privilege to evangelize many of them who are now here. In fact, when I evangelized them, they were young people. Now today, grandparents. And I've had the opportunity to officiate their weddings, their funeral services, their baptisms, their baby dedications. And now I've had the opportunity to watch their children grow up and have had the opportunity to watch their children get married, and I have officiated those weddings, and now I'm baptizing their children and dedicating their children now, and watching now their children, watching the grandchildren now coming out of high school and preparing to go into college. That's how long I've been around, and I consider it an honor and a privilege, and it's been one of the best things that's ever happened to my life, in my life. Now, we now move from Luke's narrative about the Apostle Paul to one of the most poignant, one of the most powerful and inspiring epistles from the pen of the Apostle himself. Here, in the next few chapters, as we begin to unfold and unpack leadership, we're going to look at some key passages from the second book of Corinthians. It is the most personal, it is the most biographical, and the most passionate of all of Paul's canonical letters, and the richest insight into the quality of his leadership. In the chronology of Paul's life, his relationship with Corinth preceded that with the Maltese shipwreck by about a decade. Now, if you remember, we left off in our last session talking about how the ship had moved along from the port of. They were attempting to go to the port of Phoenix on the island of Crete, and they wound up leaving Fairhavens. That's where they were. They were attempting to get to Phoenix, and as a result, remember, the storm was raging, the gale force winds, it's hurricane force winds, and they wound up being taken literally over 2,000 kilometers. The storm blew them off course, and they wound up going all the way to the island of Malta, which is south of Italy, or what's known as the Italian boot, because you remember that was the shape of the country, and down into the southern part of Sicily. Now, so this is where we left off. Now, that incident, the incident of the Maltese shipwreck, when they landed on the island of Malta, okay? I want you to understand that Paul had already been in Corinth 10 years before that. 10 years before that. You have to recall that the Apostle Paul had journeyed for many, many years. He was on the road, so to speak. He had taken 3 major missionary journeys from the year 30 AD all the way to the year 68 AD. Does that give you an idea of how long he had traveled? Now, I've been going to the mission field now for 33 years. From the very beginning of ministry, I began to get involved in the Great Commission and worldwide discipleship and evangelism, and even training pastors right from the very beginning. And so I've done this now for over 30 years. Paul finds himself in a similar situation, or rather, I find myself in a similar situation as the Apostle Paul. Now, he was at Corinth about 10 years before this shipwreck took place in the Maltese island. Right? And so Paul first came to Corinth during his second missionary journey in approximately around the year 50 AD, somewhere. And in your notes, I want you to understand, you'll see this in your notes, and those of you who are tuning in right now, you need to download them. You're going to have a number of maps that are going to be included in your handouts there. And I think I have like 4 maps in here. This first one is an overall picture of all of his journeys, Paul's journeys from 30 AD all the way to 60 AD. And then you're going to have a second journey, his secondary journey, okay? You're going to see that, his second journey there from the Palm. And that's from the year roughly between 49 and 51 AD. And then you're going to see a third missionary journey that took place, and that's from the year 52 to 57. And it describes in details the maps. You could clearly see everything I've been talking to you about in this particular course. And then finally, Paul's journey to Rome, and that's between 57 and 62 AD. And this is where he goes to his death. So you're going to see these in your notes. You can pull those out and you can make reference to them as you're studying along with me. And I include that in there, and this is greatly provided to us by Rose Publishing, Now, the shipwreck episode on the Maltese island, that's about 10 years later, and we've already examined what occurred after his third and final missionary journey was complete, and that's somewhere around the year 60 and 61 A.D. So as a prelude to our study of 2 Corinthians, we have to move back about 9 chapters in our story in the book of Acts and 1 full decade in time. So you remember that we spent a lot of time in Acts chapter 27, and then we moved in slowly into Acts chapter 28 briefly. However, we're going to move back about 9 chapters, okay? That's what we're going to do, roughly somewhere in there. We're going to move about 9 chapters back and about 10 years earlier, okay? And so I want you to understand that just for the moment. Now, Paul wrote 2 Corinthians specifically, and it was specifically designed to defend his apostleship and to answer some of the major threats to his leadership in the church at Corinth. Listen to me very carefully. It's not if you ever will be threatened in your leadership, it's when it will occur. Now, if you've been around long enough, okay, in ministry, you know that's going to happen. It always happens somewhere along the line. If you listen to the great preachers of today, I'm talking about the men who've already passed the test of time. The men that you can hear clearly on television and radio, and who have been around for 30, 40, 50 years in the same church and ministry. And although they don't share in detail some of the things, and some of them have shared in detail briefly, albeit, of what's taken place in their leadership at their local church, you will discover that every single one of them have been challenged in their ministry, and I have experienced the same. So now it's not if you're going to be challenged, it's when you're going to be challenged. So in 2 Corinthians, that's the reason why I tell you that the second book of Corinthians and understanding leadership, biblical leadership, ecclesiastical leadership, church leadership is so crucial in the life of a young pastor. You need to understand this. This should be the very first thing you need to understand, because it's going to rock your world. It will turn your world upside down when it happens, and usually you have no one to go to. Go to the Word of God. So here he opened his heart very personally on the matter of leadership in the second book of Corinthians. In many ways, this is one epistle alone would stand as a wonderful manual for leaders. I believe the second book, and I teach a whole course just on 2 Corinthians. In fact, it's multiple courses on it. If we worked our way systematically through the entire epistle, we could fill a large volume with insight on leadership drawn just from the second book of Corinthians. That, however, would make this teaching far too unwieldy, and it'd be a daunting task for many of you to be able to bear. However, I have attempted to do so, and I am in the process, in fact, of doing so, because I really feel it's that important. So my goal in the next few chapters is to simply to narrow in on some of the highlights of 2 Corinthians and to glean some of the major principles it teaches for leaders, and to try to sense the heart of a true leader by seeing how the Apostle Paul bared his own soul to those who were under his pastoral and apostolic care. And that's what we're going to be drawing ourselves to. Remember, I said to you earlier, we're going to go back about 9, 10 chapters back from where we are in Acts chapter 27 and 28, and then about 10 years earlier in time. In the meantime, I want to draw your attention to Acts chapter 17. That's where we want to go to. Acts chapter 17. Now, to set the context for what we're about to study, we need to know something about the city of Corinth. That's really what we need to understand. The church Paul founded there. It was in the city of Corinth. And the circumstances that provoked Paul to write this particular epistle to the church. And I want you to see how Paul brought the gospel to Corinth. In Acts chapter 18, describes how Paul first came to Corinth after his visit to the great city of Athens. That's where he was prior to arriving at Corinth, where he had just given a defense of his teaching to the philosophers in the midst of the Areopagus, which was a court of the Athenian intelligentsia. Okay, this is where all the smart aleck were. This is where all the smart people were. This is where all the smug philosophers were. This was the uppity class, and all the intelligent people were there. Named for the hill where it was located next to the Parthenon. And you're going to see this in Acts chapter 17. So let's go specifically into Acts chapter 17. And we're going to pick up the story starting around verse 22 and work our way down to verse 34. It was about a 45-mile journey west along the coast of the Saronic Gulf from the Athens to Corinth. This is more or less, and you'll see this in your maps, or you look up at any good map of that day, Bible maps, you can find it, specifically maps in Corinth. Let's pick up the story. Acts chapter 17, verse 22. So Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I observe that you are very religious in all respects. For while I was passing through the examining the objects of your worship, I also found an altar with the inscription, 'To an unknown God.' Therefore, what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and all the things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in the temples made with hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all people life and breath in all things. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation." This is a clear description of the sovereignty of God. That they would seek God if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and exist. Even some of your own poets have said, for we also are his children. In verse 29, being then the children of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and thought of man. Therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance, God is now declaring to men that all people everywhere should repent, because he has fixed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness through a man, notice capital man, whom he has appointed, having furnished proof to all men by raising him from the dead. A clear reference to the person of Jesus Christ. Now, when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some began to sneer, and others said, "We shall hear you again concerning this." So Paul went out of their midst, but some men joined him and believed, among whom also were Dionysius and Areopagus, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. So at some point in time, while he is speaking here in the Areopagus, you have a number of people that come to Christ and they believe. Now, it is important that we understand a little bit about Corinth, because you have to understand the background of how a church, a Gentile church, is established in Corinth. And yet, Corinth, which is a vile, absolutely vile and vulgar place, okay, you'll see this in a little bit as I describe it to you, is also filled with many Jews who are living there, who are faithful to their local synagogue. So we have this dichotomy as being presented to us, where you have God's people, the Jews, are living in the midst of this Gentile decadence, okay? And then we have Gentiles where the church is about to be formed. Now, Corinth is located on a narrow isthmus that connects the mainland of Greece with the Peloponnese, and which is a large peninsula that defines southern Greece, and you'll see these in your notes. The isthmus is only 4 miles wide at its narrowest point, and that is where Corinth is strategically situated. This is exactly where it is. Today, there's a deep canal there near Corinth that allows ships to pass. It would be almost like We know it in the United States, or at least in the Western Hemisphere of the world. We know the Panama Canal. Something similar to that has now developed in Corinth. In the first century, however, ships were actually brought ashore. They were put on skids and rollers, and then they were transported across the isthmus to the other side, all except the very largest ships traveling the trade routes between the Adriatic Sea and the Aegean Sea usually chose this particular route. Why? Because the 250-mile voyage around the south of Greece was so treacherous and time-consuming. So this is literally what would happen. You had one sea on this side, Corinth, and another sea on this side. And the narrowest point is about 4 miles long maximum. So when they would put these ships, they would bring them on shore, and they had these gigantic rollers, and they would literally roll these ships over. And these ships would come over all the way on to the other side. Okay? And that would take them, and they could successfully do this within roughly about a 25 to 30-day period. They can move this big ship over and all their cargo and all their crew and everything. Otherwise, they would have to go around to the southern part of Greece all the way around, and that was a 250-mile voyage out of their way, and it was very costly. And as a result, Corinth became mega rich. Do you hear me? It became mega rich. It became filthy rich, if you could put it this way. And as a result, there was no shortage, no such thing as shortage in Corinth, because it just poured in with money. And with it came all the decadence that you can conceive of it. Right? If you think of Las Vegas in Nevada in the United States as a place of decadence, if you think of Amsterdam in Holland, where all the brothels are out in the open as a place of decadence, okay? Or if you think of where I happen to live in Los Angeles, California, I'm only like maybe 15 minutes away from Hollywood. There's clearly a place of decadence. This was the city of Corinth. This is where Paul comes to establish a church, where you have a clear statement of contradiction, where you have a large Jewish population with synagogues there, and now you have Corinthians. These were slaves and ex-soldiers, and the decadent of the most decadent had arrived to live in this city, and this is where Paul comes to establish a church, and his leadership is about to be proven.